On the night of March the 8th, 2014, a Boeing 777, one of the largest, most advanced passenger jets ever built, 210 feet long, carrying 239 living human beings, took off into a calm, clear night, climbed to 35,000 feet, and simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Not crashed in front of witnesses, not blown apart on radar, vanished. One moment it was a routine red-eye to Beijing, pilot calmly signing off with air traffic control. Less than 2 minutes later, it was gone. Its transponder dark, its radio silent. And then, instead of continuing to China, it turned around, flew back across an entire country, and headed off into the longest, emptiest stretch of ocean on Earth, where it flew on for hours more before it fell into the sea. To this day, more than 12 years later, after the most expensive search in aviation history, not one body has been recovered. The main wreckage has never been found, and no one anywhere knows for certain what happened or why. This is Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, greatest mystery in the history of aviation. A modern jumbo jet that the entire technological might of the 21st century has been unable to find. How does a plane that big simply disappear? Who turned it around, and why? And how is it possible that, in our age of total surveillance, we still cannot answer the most basic question a family can ask? Where are the people we loved? To even begin, Paulshin, we have to go back to a quiet airport terminal in Kuala Lumpur, just after midnight. It is just past midnight on Saturday, March the 8th, 2014, at Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is preparing for an ordinary overnight journey north to Beijing, China, a flight of about 6 hours. The aircraft is a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9MMRO. It is one of the safest, trusted airliners in the world. At that point in history, the 777 had one of the finest safety records of any jet ever built. This particular aircraft was nearly 12 years old, well maintained, with no known serious problems. Aboard were 239 people, 227 passengers and 12 crew. The majority were Chinese citizens. Others came from Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, India, the United States, and a dozen other nations. There were families, business travelers, a group of Chinese calligraphers, young children, and a couple heading home. In the cockpit sat 2 pilots. The captain was Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, highly experienced senior pilot, with more than 18,000 flying hours, well respected, an aviation enthusiast, who even had a flight simulator set up at home. The first officer was Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, final stage of his training, on the 777. Neither man, by every account available before that night, had any reason anyone could find to do harm. In the cargo holds beneath the passengers sat the ordinary freight of an international flight, and 2 items that would later feed the theories. There were several tons of fresh mangosteens, a tropical fruit, and there were around 200 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries, the same kind of rechargeable battery that powers phones and laptops, and the same kind that, under the wrong conditions, can overheat and catch fire. At the time, one gave the cargo a second thought. Later, when people searched for any explanation at all, that load of batteries would become one more thread to pull. Hold it in mind. At 41 minutes past midnight, Flight 370 lifted off the runway and climbed into a clear, calm night, turning northeast over the Gulf of Thailand, on the standard route toward Vietnamese airspace, and then on to China. For the first 38 minutes, everything was utterly, perfectly normal. The aircraft climbed to its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The crew checked in with controllers exactly as they should. There was no distress call, no warning, hint of anything wrong. And then came the last anyone would ever knowingly hear from Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. At around 1:30 in the morning, Flight 370 was approaching the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the point where Malaysian controllers would hand the aircraft off to their counterparts. In Ho Chi Minh City, Malaysian controller radioed the handover instruction, and the cockpit replied in a calm, ordinary voice, "Good night, Malaysian 370. That was it. 6 words. A routine sign-off, kind exchanged thousands of times a night, across the world's skies. It is the last verified human communication from the flight. Within moments of those words, the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts its identity, position, and altitude to air traffic control, switched off, and on the controller's screens, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 simply blinked out of existence. At first, no one panicked. Planes occasionally dropped briefly off civilian radar. The assumption was a glitch, or that the flight had passed into Vietnamese coverage. But the Vietnamese controllers never saw it. They expected MH370 to check in. It never did. As the minutes stretched into an hour, and then more, confusion turned to dread. The aircraft was not where it should be. It was not talking to anyone. It was not answering calls. The plane, with 239 people aboard, had, as far as the civilian world could tell, ceased to exist somewhere over the South China Sea. The search that began in those first hours looked there, in the sea between Malaysia and Vietnam, along the planned route. And that it would turn out was entirely the wrong ocean. Because while the civilian radar had lost the plane, something else had not. In the days that followed, Malaysian military radar data revealed something that turned the entire disaster on its head, something that transformed it from a tragic accident into a genuine, profound mystery. After its transponder went dark, Flight 370 did not continue on toward Beijing. It turned, sharply. It banked back to the southwest, flew back across the Malay Peninsula, back over the country it had just left, and then tracked up the Strait of Malacca to the west, in completely the opposite direction from its destination. And this was no random drift. The turnback was a deliberate, controlled maneuver. The aircraft followed established navigation waypoints. It changed altitude. It flew with intention, as though guided by a knowing hand, for over an hour after it vanished from civilian screens, before finally passing beyond the range of military radar out over the Andaman Sea, northwest of Malaysia. Someone, or something, had turned that airplane around and flown it deliberately away from where the entire world was looking. There is one more haunting fragment from that stretch over land. As the aircraft passed back near the island of Penang, a mobile phone belonging to the first officer, Farik, briefly registered with a cell tower on the ground, the kind of fleeting connection a phone makes when it is switched on and passes within range. A single, silent electronic flicker, and then nothing. No call was made, message sent. It told investigators only that the plane had indeed flown low and close enough to land for a phone aboard to reach a tower. And then it was gone again, out over the water. And then it flew on, into the dark, beyond the reach of any radar on Earth. At that point, every conventional way of tracking the aircraft was gone. By any normal measure, the trail ended there, in the middle of the night, over open water, except for one thing that almost no one, at first, even thought to check. The plane was still whispering to a satellite. High above the Indian Ocean sat a communications satellite operated by a British company called Inmarsat. And although the aircraft's main communication systems had gone silent, a piece of equipment aboard the 777 kept doing something automatic and almost invisible. Roughly once an hour, exchanged a tiny electronic handshake with the satellite, a digital ping, confirming the connection was still alive. These pings carried no location, no message, no content. They were, in effect, the aircraft quietly raising its hand once an hour to say only, "I am still here." And here is where the story produces one of the most remarkable feats of detective work in modern history. A team of engineers at Inmarsat realized those meaningless little pings might not be meaningless after all. By analyzing them with extraordinary care, measuring the precise timing of each signal, and tiny shifts in its frequency caused by the satellites and the aircraft's relative motion, an effect related to the Doppler shift you hear when a siren passes, they could work backwards to calculate roughly how far the aircraft had been from the satellite at each ping. Each handshake placed the plane somewhere on a vast curved line across the Earth, and the final ping, about 7 hours after takeoff, placed it on what became known as the seventh arc, an immense curving line that swept down into one of the most remote, deepest, least explored stretches of ocean anywhere on the planet, the southern Indian Ocean, thousands of miles southwest of Australia. And there was one final chilling detail buried in the satellite data. About 8 minutes after that seventh arc handshake, there was one more partial signal, an incomplete attempt by the aircraft's equipment to log back on to the satellite. Engineers interpreted this as the system rebooting after a sudden loss of power, exactly what you would expect if the engines had flamed out from fuel exhaustion and a backup power unit had briefly kicked in. Worse, the analysis of that final signal suggested the aircraft may have been descending at an extreme accelerating rate at the end, not gliding gently, but plunging. It was the faintest possible electronic echo of the last seconds of Flight 370, and it pointed toward a violent end. The conclusion was staggering. After turning back across Malaysia, Flight 370 had flown on for around 7 hours total, south and further south, deep into an empty ocean where there are no islands, no shipping lanes, no radar, nothing but cold, deep water for thousands of miles in every direction. It had flown until, the analysis suggested, it ran out of fuel, and then it had come down, somewhere along that seventh arc, into seas up to 4 miles deep. The search teams had been combing the wrong ocean entirely. The plane was almost certainly on the far side of the world, from where they had started looking. It is worth pausing on how chaotic and painful those first days were, because the early response became part of the tragedy. In the crucial first week, before the military radar and satellite analysis were fully understood, the enormous international search was aimed at the wrong place entirely, the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand, along the original flight path. Ships and planes from more than 24 nations combed seas where the aircraft had never gone. Malaysian authorities were criticized, fairly or not, for confused and contradictory statements, for being slow to share military radar data, and for a communications effort that left grieving families, especially the Chinese relatives, who staged anguished protests in Beijing, feeling misled and abandoned. False leads multiplied. Reported oil slicks that proved unrelated supposed debris sightings that turned out to be ordinary ocean rubbish, even fraudulent photographs. Days of the most precious search time, when the black boxes were still pinging, were lost. What followed became the largest and most expensive search in aviation history. Ships and aircraft from dozens of countries converged on the southern Indian Ocean. They scoured the surface for debris. They listened with underwater microphones for the pings of the black box's locator beacons. Beacons whose batteries, tragically, last only about 30 days, and which fell silent before the searchers could pin them down. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau took the lead in coordinating an underwater search of the seabed along the seventh arc, mapping a stretch of ocean floor that had never before been charted in some of the most hostile waters on Earth, with underwater vehicles crawling through near total darkness, miles beneath the waves. To understand why a plane could be lost, even after the search zone was identified, you have to understand what that part of the ocean is actually like. The seventh arc crosses some of the most forbidding seafloor on the planet, a region including a vast underwater plateau and ridge system where the depths plunge to 4, 5, even 6 kilometers below the surface into permanent, crushing, pitch-black cold. Much of it had never been mapped by anyone, ever. Searchers first had to chart the terrain itself, then send robotic submarines crawling just above a seabed of canyons, cliffs, and volcanic mountains, scanning a sliver at a time. A single piece of wreckage in that immensity is a needle in 1,000 haystacks in the dark miles underwater. The wonder is not that the plane has been so hard to find. Wonder is that anyone believed it could be found at all. Over roughly 3 years, that official search combed some 120,000 square kilometers of seabed, an area the size of a small country. They found undersea volcanoes and ancient shipwrecks no human had ever seen. They did not find Flight 370. In January 2017, after 1,046 days, the official search was suspended, having found nothing of the aircraft on the ocean floor. Then, in 2018, a private American company called Ocean Infinity took up the hunt under a remarkable arrangement: no find, no fee. They would search at their own expense, only be paid if they actually found the wreck. They deployed a fleet of autonomous submarines and swept tens of thousands more square kilometers. And they too came back empty-handed. And yet the ocean did, eventually, give back small pieces of the truth. In July of 2015, nearly a year and a half after the disappearance, a man on a beach on the island of Réunion, a French island in the western Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the search zone, found a barnacle-encrusted piece of aircraft wing washed up in the surf. It was a flaperon, a control surface from the trailing edge of a wing, and when investigators examined it, confirmed it. This was a part of a Boeing 777. There was only one missing 777 in the world. It was from Flight 370. It was the first physical proof, after 17 months of uncertainty, that the aircraft had truly gone down in the Indian Ocean. Over the following months and years, more pieces drifted ashore. On the coasts of Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, Mauritius, and Tanzania, 30 pieces of debris were eventually recovered that were confirmed or considered very likely to be from MH370, most of them carried across the ocean by currents over months and years. Scientists used the drift patterns of these fragments and the marine life growing on them to try to refine where the plane had entered the water. Some of those fragments told their own quiet, grim story. Scientists studied the barnacles growing on the Réunion flaperon, trying to read its time at sea like rings in a tree. And crucially, a few of the recovered pieces came from inside the aircraft. Sections of cabin interior. Investigators noted that for interior pieces to be torn loose and float away, the aircraft had most likely broken apart with great force on impact, rather than being gently set down on the water. To some analysts, argued against the idea of a skilled pilot ditching the plane intact in a controlled glide and pointed instead toward a high-speed, uncontrolled descent into the sea, consistent with that final partial satellite signal. The debris confirmed, beyond reasonable doubt, that Flight 370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean. But debris on a distant beach cannot tell you the precise spot a plane fell 2 years earlier, and it certainly cannot tell you why. The central wreckage, the fuselage, the engines, the cockpit, the black boxes that record every second of a flight, and the people, all of it remained and remains lost. So we are left with the question that has consumed investigators, aviation experts, and millions of ordinary people for over a decade. What happened aboard Flight 370? With no wreckage and no recorders, every explanation is a theory, but they fall into a few broad possibilities, and it is worth weighing each honestly. The first, and the one many investigators quietly consider most likely, is deliberate human action, that someone in the cockpit intentionally diverted the aircraft. The evidence that points this way is the behavior of the plane itself. The transponder going dark right at the airspace handover, precise, deliberate turnback along known navigation waypoints, the long controlled flight into the most remote ocean on Earth. This was not, many argue, the behavior of a crippled or pilotless machine. Suspicion fell, inevitably, on the experienced captain, and it emerged that on his home flight simulator, he had at some point plotted a route that ran south into the southern Indian Ocean, a detail that many found deeply troubling. And this matters enormously. No motive was ever established, no evidence of a plan was ever found, and the official investigations explicitly declined to blame him or anyone else. He was a respected professional with no known reason to commit such an act. The simulator data is suggestive, not proof. To this day, accusing any individual remains exactly that, an accusation unproven. Second major theory is the opposite of deliberate, a catastrophic accident that left a ghost flight. In this version, something went wrong early. Perhaps a fire, perhaps a sudden loss of cabin pressure that incapacitated everyone aboard. If the cabin depressurized and the crew were overcome by hypoxia, lack of oxygen, before they could respond, the aircraft could have flown on for hours on autopilot, with everyone aboard already unconscious or dead, until its fuel ran out and it glided down into the sea. The Australian investigators considered an unresponsive crew, hypoxia scenario, to be consistent with much of the satellite data. The difficulty is that a simple accident struggles to explain the deliberate looking turn back, and the switching off of communication. Each theory explains part of the evidence and stumbles on the rest. This is also where that cargo comes back. Some have argued for an onboard fire, perhaps originating in those 200 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries in the hold or in the electrical systems. A fire could explain a great deal. Turning back toward the nearest airport in an emergency, switching off electrical systems to isolate the blaze, climbing or descending to fight it, and then being overcome by smoke before they could land, leaving the aircraft to fly on. It is a coherent story, but it struggles to explain why the plane flew for 7 more hours with such apparent navigational purpose, deep into an empty ocean, rather than coming down far sooner. Every theory, in the end, runs into the same wall. Some part of the evidence it simply cannot account for. And then there are the others. An electrical failure that knocked out systems and overwhelmed the crew. Hijacking by someone other than the pilots. Mechanical failure of a kind never seen before. Early on, there was even brief suspicion around 2 passengers traveling on stolen passports. But they turned out to be migrants seeking asylum, with no link to terrorism. Over 12 years, no theory has ever been proven, because the one thing that could settle it, the aircraft and its black boxes, has never been found. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, sitting somewhere on the floor of the Indian Ocean, hold the answer. We simply cannot reach them, and the search has never truly ended. Driven by the families, who have refused for over a decade to let the world move on, the hunt was revived again. In 2024, the Malaysian government agreed to a new no-find, no-fee search. And in 2025, Ocean Infinity returned to the southern Indian Ocean with a new generation of autonomous underwater drones, sweeping fresh areas of the seabed along the 7th arc. Through 2025 and into early 2026, they surveyed thousands more square kilometers of ocean floor. And once again, as of this telling, more than 12 years after the disappearance, they have found no confirmed trace of the aircraft. The families continue to press for the search to go on. The mystery, for now, endures. If there is any meaning to be drawn from so much unresolved grief, it lies in what MH370 forced the world of aviation to confront. The disappearance exposed a shocking gap in the modern age, that a giant airliner could switch off its own tracking and vanish, and that for vast stretches of the world's oceans, we had no continuous way of knowing where an aircraft actually was. In an era of constant connectivity, planes over open ocean were still in effect, reporting their position only intermittently, and a deliberate hand could silence even that. In the years since, that gap has begun to close. International aviation authorities moved to require airliners to report their position far more frequently and to develop systems that track aircraft in distress automatically, so that a plane in trouble cannot simply slip into silence and disappear. The goal is brutally simple and was bought with the anguish of 239 families. Never again should the world lose track of where a passenger plane is. MH370 did not change a single rivet on an airplane. It changed our relationship with the certainty that we always know where they are, and it is the human cost that should never be lost beneath the intrigue. 239 people. Among them were ordinary lives in mid-stride, a pair of young Iranian men chasing a new future in Europe, a group of celebrated Chinese artists returning from an exhibition, engineers, grandparents, husbands and wives, small children who should now be teenagers. For the families they left, the cruelty of MH370 is a specific and terrible one. There has been no funeral with a body, no wreckage to stand before, no certainty to mourn against. For over a decade, the relatives, many of them organized under a group called Voice 370, have fought to keep the search alive, traveling the world, confronting officials, refusing the closure the rest of us were allowed to drift toward. Their grief has no edges because their loss has no end. It is they, more than anyone, who still need the ocean to give up its answer. So Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains what it became in the first dark hours of that March morning. A plane full of people who said goodnight, turned into the darkness, and were never seen again. We know roughly where they went. We know, almost certainly, that they came to rest somewhere in the cold and the dark at the bottom of the southern Indian Ocean. But we do not know how. We do not know why. And until the day someone finds that wreckage on the ocean floor, 239 people remain suspended in an unbearable in-between. Gone, but never found. Mourned, but never explained. Perhaps part of why MH370 grips us so completely is what it says about our age. We have built a world that feels fully mapped, fully tracked, fully known. A world where we can summon a car to our exact location and watch a storm form on the other side of the planet in real time. MH370 punctured that illusion in a single night. It reminded us that a machine the size of a building full of people could still slip through every net we had woven and vanish into a blank space on the map. It is the modern world's ghost story, haunting from the distant past, but a void at the very center of our most advanced technology. And the not knowing is its own kind of horror, cleaner and colder than any wreckage, because the imagination fills it with everything at once. It is the defining mystery of modern aviation, and a humbling reminder that for all our satellites and all our certainty, the Earth is still vast, the oceans are still deep, some questions still refuse to be answered. The families are still waiting. The search may yet go on, and perhaps, one day, the sea will finally give up its most famous secret. On this channel, we follow the great mysteries and disasters of the sky, the ones that changed how we fly, and the ones that still have no ending. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, tell me in the comments what you believe happened to Flight 370. I read every single one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.